please come to the stage. It's been quite a long day, and now we're going to talk in depth about data. We're going to talk with Lee Fulmer, we're going to talk with Sonia Cooper, and we're going to talk with, I don't know if I'm going to say your surname right, so please correct me if I get it wrong, Elena Simperl. And this is our last session of the day before we go into the drinks and books signing. I really appreciate you all bearing with us and still looking attentive, which you do. Can I ask each of you just to very quickly introduce yourselves, because you've not been up on the stage before today. Lee, do you want to start?
My name is Lee Fulmer. I'm the chair of the Finance Advisory Board for OpenUK, and I'm also a senior advisor at McKinsey. My background started in tech, but has been in financial services for the last 24 years, as you may have guessed from the question I asked earlier about funding in the UK economy and markets.
I am Elena Simperl. I'm a professor of computer science here at King's in the informatics department just across the road. I am an AI scientist, and I have a background in something called knowledge representation, which in a way is a form of data. So I'm also the director of research at the Open Data Institute. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we do about data and AI there.
Hi, I'm Sonia Cooper, Assistant General Counsel in the Open Innovation team at Microsoft, where I lead the work on IP policy. My background is I'm a patent attorney. I've worked with Microsoft Research for a number of years on their AI inventions. I'm also the chair of the Data and Copyright Committee of IP Federation.
So I was gesticulating there to the team to see if we can get mics turned up, please. So Lee and Elena, I can't hear you very well, so I'm assuming the room can't, but Sonia, I think you're quite clear. So I'm going to come to you, Elena, first and ask you, the last panel was talking about data. Data comes up continuously. Can you give us a bit of a landscape around AI and data?
Mm-hmm. How much time do we have?
Yeah, well, can you do it in like 2 to 3 minutes?
Okay, great. So we've heard a lot about, in the previous panel, about what drives innovation in AI at the moment, and that is not particularly new, advanced, interesting architectures, but access to data, access to infrastructure. So one thing that we need more of, and we may run out of, is new good data. The other thing is access to data across the ecosystem to encourage competition and innovation. We need better, more appropriate ways to use data across the ecosystem. So I mean licenses that account for...
So you think we need more licenses?
Well, we need different licenses. We need different licenses, and we need a change in how developers and AI data publishers understand what licenses are and aren't. Okay. So if you look at the latest studies, say on Hugging Face, 30% of data sets have a license, and of those, lots of those, 80% of those licenses don't actually apply.
And this has been a challenge time immemorial with open source, right? So yeah. Open source software developers have historically tried to put data under software licenses, or where they've had a data license, like a Creative Commons license that they've put on software. So there is a big education piece, and I think Hugging Face, GitHub, the repos can really help with that. They already did a couple of years ago by adding a statement that if you don't put a license on, it's in the public domain, which doesn't exist in every country, people won't use your code. So there's probably some practical steps that we can do around that. Lee, coming to you on this data context, do you have any thoughts around the data, the need for access to it, licensing, what the data is around AI that we want to get access to?
So I think people hugely underestimate the importance of data in driving AI generally. And again, as was mentioned earlier, this isn't ChatGPT in the last 2 years. This goes back 50, 60 years now. I cut my teeth in tech in the 80s writing algorithms and Lisp and Ada. And those things required data in order to function and operate. So I think the biggest challenge that we have as a society at the moment is that most of the large language models that are out there are owned in commercial hands. I think they're trained on public data, and let's be honest, they're, back to Andreas's point, not peer-reviewed, what's in them. I don't like to talk about quality because I think it's subjective, but the correctness of the data for the application is flawed. So I think the idea that what we need is within the open source community, a movement towards open data, I spoke about this at SOCON 24, is hugely important. If we want to drive innovation, if we want to drive acceptance and adoption, we need to have data sets that people can use and that they can trust, and that, you know, maybe we do need a licensing model, to the point you made, to make sure that there's a validation there rather than a cost associated.
Correct.
But we need some sort of mechanism, I think, to really drive things.
So we need a mechanism to drive this forward, but we have a massive issue in the UK. And in the report, we do a little synopsis of what's happened in the UK, from the House of Lords doing the inquiry on LLMs, the response from Michelle Donlan on behalf of the British government, and Baroness Stowell, who spoke at State of OpenCon, Baroness Stowell's response to Michelle Donlan. And there is a particular phrase she uses that I like, and she's talking about a very challenging issue. She uses the phrase political heft, and she says there is a lack of political heft being put behind this particular data challenge by the UK government. And what she's talking about is the ability to train models in the UK. Now, everybody I've spoken to, even companies that have come out of the UK who want to train models, will not do it here. Sonia, I know this is a subject dear to your heart. Do you want to explain why?
Oh, so I think the legal clarity in the UK is problematic when it comes to text and data mining. So there was an effort to develop a code of practice last year, which didn't conclude. But essentially, the UK didn't implement the EU copyright directive, and so the UK has been left with a text and data mining exception, copyright exception for non-commercial purposes, but not for commercial purposes. So where does that
Hang
leave
on,
us?
what does that mean? You can train, you know for sure that you can train if it's a non-commercial purpose, but if you're going to end up with a commercial utilization, you don't know for sure.
Well, if you're training for commercial purposes, or I mean, text and data mining is incredibly broad, right?
Yeah.
It's any analysis, looking at data and trying to identify patterns. That's text and data mining. So that relates to codecs. It relates to any kind of inference, really. But commercial text and data mining in the UK doesn't have an explicit copyright exception. Having said that, there are a number of exceptions that will still apply.
So I'm going to pause you again. So text and data mining in the UK doesn't have an explicit exception,
Yeah.
which means we don't have an equivalent to fair use in the US. Is that a fair understanding?
No, well,
Something
I mean,
slightly
we don't have something explicit as they have in the EU, which was introduced. And actually, there was a lot of question during the implementation of, or the discussions around the EU copyright directive as to whether or not they even needed a text and data mining exception. But they introduced it
Right.
for clarity.
Yeah.
So it didn't really give anything more than it was. But because you suddenly have in the UK an exception for non-commercial but not for commercial, it does start to raise questions. But I think, the UK is a signatory of TRIPS, as is the US, and in TRIPS, Article 9.2 of TRIPS says that copyright protects the expression of ideas, but it doesn't extend to protection of the underlying ideas, not the concepts. Otherwise, you couldn't read and learn from copyright works. And essentially, that's the situation we have in the UK at the moment. We're relying on, TRIPS, we're relying on exceptions that, like the temporary copies exception, for example, to ensure that we're able to read and learn from publicly available works, and we should be able to use machines to do that. So there are exceptions that apply. But, do we have legal certainty there? Certainly not in the UK, because there's a lack of clarity in the UK.
There's a lack of clarity. So Neil mentioned the balance report. and the Valence report was handed to the Intellectual Property Office, who were
Yeah.
going to create this clarity, right? So where is it?
Yes, no, good point. Microsoft was involved in those discussions, as were lots of other companies and research organizations, trade associations. And the point of the code of conduct that the IPO was developing on the recommendation of the Valence report was really to provide this clarity. But unfortunately, it didn't conclude. But I think
That's a very polite way of saying, Sonia, that the FT headline was the question is too difficult, and it's being passed back from the IPO to DCIT, and DCIT are now sitting in the question, right? So this has to be one of the key things for the next government, surely.
Absolutely, but I think it's also in asking the right questions. You know, is it a question as to whether licenses apply? And I don't think licenses are needed for analysing data as publicly available. I don't think a license is needed for that. You might need a license agreement to access data, or you might need a license agreement for something that is a copyright infringement if you want to republish it, if you want to do something. But to analyse it, there should be a requirement for licenses.
But is there not a potential issue there where the data that you do the training with creates a derivative work? Because doesn't that create a legal sort of quagmire? Because if you use a copyrighted piece of information that somebody else has, and you use that as a foundation to build something else, then you're actually building off their work without a license.
So I think it goes back to basics, and it's a question of what you're doing with the work. You know, are you using it at inference? Are you kind of putting it in at one end and actually trying to get a derivative work out? You know, you can do that. That would be a copyright infringement. But when you're training across a vast, corpus of data, and you're actually analysing it so that you're actually extracting ideas, and then you're outputting something that is based on those concepts, you're not creating a derivative work when you're looking at, that information flow, if you like. But I think just going back to kind of where we could kind of go back to is what are the ways in which we can address some of these issues? And I think rights holders are concerned about, things being output that are copyright infringements, and actually model developers are starting to introduce controls in their products to prevent that. But I think beyond that, there are other mechanisms that don't require a change in the law, but actually could be implemented through a voluntary code of practice, like enabling people to just say, I'm making my information available on the internet, but actually I don't want it used for AI training. And I think, that's something also that could be a topic for
Elena, I think you
further
want to jump
discussion.
in.
Yeah, and I was just going back to the conversation we had earlier about Hugging Face and other open source ecosystems, right? Where I totally agree with you that education piece is very much needed, because just listening to Sonia's explanations, myself as a technologist, I understand perhaps half of it, and it sounds like quite a complicated, nuanced discussion. Now compare that with what is happening at the moment in the ecosystem, including in my own team. Data sets are hard to create. We're incentivizing not data set creation and curation and thinking before computing, but actually just getting higher on a leaderboard to improve on a number of artificially defined metrics. So people just take someone else's data set they find online, and they add a few features, and they move it around a little bit and improve it in some minor way, and then stuck it on a Hugging Face, add some random license they find on it, and then the whole ecosystem perpetuates this sort of behavior, right? So we need to change that. We need to improve education when it comes to how to reuse someone else's data responsibly, and how to also make sure that the data that you create and you publish can be used effectively by others. And that's not the case at the moment. So you have, on Hugging Face, you have maybe a 10-15% increase in the number of data sets published every week. So we're reaching by now 200,000. Lots of them are copies, lots of them are minor improvements compared to what is there. And this sort of conversations that we just had about what is it that data is used for? Where does it come from? Is this a matter of, like you were explaining, accessing the data to read and learn versus accessing the data to produce a derivative work? That doesn't happen in those forums, and it has to. I'm not saying it's intentional, but we should also stop perpetuating and incentivizing these sort of behaviors.
So what we saw back in the day, I mentioned earlier that Leslie, who was on the stage with Will, she and I worked together 25 years ago in the dot-com bubble. And what we saw then was an attempt to apply the way that we had worked to the internet as we dealt with this new technology. And we sat down and we drafted and we negotiated linking agreements. So whenever one website was going to connect to another website, us lawyers would put an agreement in place between the two websites that sometimes were heavily negotiated. Now, the concept of that working today is surreal, right? Every website links to every website. Nobody thinks twice about it. So there always has to be, as these technologies bed in, a mind shift that enables the law to catch up with the technology and the practices to catch up. You talked about building algorithms in the 80s, and I know that you've worked through many decades now, working on data. As somebody who is a practical technician around this, a leader of people who build data sets, what can we do in this AI environment with data to enable people to work better? Have you got any thoughts on how does AI data become more accessible and better for the data scientists and the ML engineers to use?
So I think there's two parts to that question, right? So there's the everyman part, sorry, I should say every person, apologies, ladies, that is about how do people in general leverage it. And then I think there's the more data practitioner side of it. Several comments have been made on the stage today about the open source community, new tools, new languages, and the need to keep up. And actually, that was in one of the videos earlier, that if you're not using the most current languages, then I don't know, you have the ability to be a part of my team. I think there's a struggle there for everybody, because it's been mentioned as well about bandwidth, right? We're humans. We have a finite bandwidth. And so how do you amass all that? So I do think that there is a very good opportunity for us as a community of practitioners to codify our experience and knowledge in such a way to help the masses, for want of a better phrase, be able to work with AI and data. And the example I like to use, because people get very nervous when you start saying that, you know, are you going to make me more efficient? Am I going to lose my job? But can I no longer write songs, right? Because the model knows every song ever recorded. I use the gold rush in America in the 1800s as a good example, right? Used to be people went down with buckets and shovels and just tried to find nuggets in the stream. I don't know who, but somebody came up with the idea of a dinner plate, effectively a gold pan, to sift out the dross, right? Get rid of the silt, get rid of the sand, get rid of the water, and you were left with the heavier elements, which was often iron pyrite, sadly, but also sometimes gold. That is what AI can do for everybody, is help you assimilate those huge amounts of information, and indeed program fragments, lines of code, to try to find the things that are more valuable to you. And again, I think the human is still needed in that equation, because unfortunately we're not at the AGI point yet, so the algorithm can't decide what is right for you, but it can point you in the right direction. And I've got a really good real-life example of doing this during the pandemic. So when I had to figure out a way to get traders to go home, because the PRA was demanding we sent everybody home, we had to figure out a way to get them to do voice trading at home. And for those of you who don't understand banking, we still use a telephone system that dates back to the 1980s. It's all hard wires, right? And that way there is no way for you to call the wrong person. We had to figure out how to get that digitized and online, but then because there were no compliance people in the room, we had to then transcribe the calls and actually try to run algorithms on them to find potential issues. So I had a bunch of compliance people who knew nothing about AI, and actually not a lot about data. What they did was pull these calls and listen. It was human interaction they were listening for. And what we managed to do was give them that gold pan. So instead of just randomly pulling an odd recording to listen to it, they were able to be told, actually focus on these 500 calls.
Okay, so what you're talking about there is sifting through this data to get to the point of what you need. and it's a very practical approach. And in a way, I think it relates back to Elena's initial comments, talking about the need for licenses to be able to use that, because the gold was just sitting there waiting for people to take it. The nuggets today are something that's very difficult to put together. Elena, do you have any more thoughts on how we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think someone said on the stage that culture change is the hardest thing to do. And referring now to the AI community, people need to pay more attention to data. And we see big tech paying attention because you see all these data deals, and we know that Google and others have been starting to transcribe YouTube videos and other user-generated content. So it's like the rush that you mentioned. But beyond that, we need a better culture as AI scientists and practitioners around the data that we create or reuse that goes into these systems to train them. I mean, at the university, we can't afford to train systems anymore, but maybe this will come back in some way, or to fine tune, so to tailor some of these systems. And that's not incentivized at the moment at all. There's a focus on improving against a number of benchmarks that have very little to do with actual real problems. And we've talked about many things.
You sound like Neil. You sound like Neil. You're saying they're not dealing
great
with
minds think alike.
real
What can I
problems.
say? Yeah. No, but so we talked a lot about what the government could do or should do. I think one good thing that the government has done is to invest in the AI hubs for real data. So these are 9 flagship projects that are looking at particular contexts, that are acknowledging the fact that, yes, we've reached benchmark saturation, is called, in a number of these machine learning tasks or goals, like machine translation, English to French, for instance. But when it comes to actual applications, you really start to see the real problems. You don't have the data. You don't have the right access to data. The data is low quality. The data needs to be stored and accessed in a certain way. There's all sorts of labor rights in the data supply chain that we don't really talk about. So you've heard perhaps of content moderation and how that's done using a number of digital platforms that are not in the UK. Mostly they're not in the Western world either. We would not, I like to use this analogy, we would not eat a sandwich that would be made of the ingredients, or we would not buy a t-shirt that would be made in the supply chain that we have at the moment in AI data. So that needs to improve as well. Finally, creating data sets takes a lot of work and a lot of resources. So especially now, for instance, if you're creating a data set to fine-tune or to safety test an AI model, back in the day, it used to be that you'd have, I don't know, your image data set, and you wanted to know if this is a cat or a mouse or a dog, and you would ask 5 people, and if 3 of them would say that's a cat, then okay, you'd know it's a cat. These questions that we're asking now, in the data sets we're creating now, are much more complex. We're saying, look at this dialogue with the chatbot. Is this racist? Is this toxic? So these sort of questions, you don't answer them by asking 5 people. You're asking them by asking hundreds and hundreds of people. You need to recruit these people in a certain way. That takes a data set to $250,000 at least. Now, who can afford to create that? And are we okay with a small part of society deciding and running the creation of these data sets?
And I think that's the issue, isn't it, when we talk about openness? Are we okay with a small part of society, and then you can add any aspect of opening up AI? When we go back to Andreas's 14 criteria, I would add one to that, where when we look at the commercialization, Neil talked about regulatory capture, and you don't actually have to have regulation to have regulatory capture. something that you could have as an indemnity in a contract that was available from a big corporate because they could self-insure when the marketplace didn't sell insurance. There are all sorts of different aspects to that regulatory capture. We are 10 minutes over time, which is a lot less than we were. The panel has been fantastic. The last panel also were fantastic, and I think mostly they're still around. I'm going to ask this panel the same question that I've asked the others. Tomorrow, election day, at the end of the day, I haven't spoken to Keir. I noticed quite a few people dropped the name earlier and said they'd spoken to Keir. I haven't spoken to Keir. But when we do speak to Keir, because he wants to open up the UK and he wants to recognise the submarine under his economy, what in 1 minute, Sonia, would you ask the next government to do to improve AI in the UK?
Oh, it's really a question of improving access to data for everyone. I think, if you are going to, whether it's through copyright laws or incentives, lock up information, you're going to entrench monopolies. And actually what you want to do is open up that access. So that would be my one thing.
Elena?
Get the NHS data AI ready.
NHS data?
Yes.
Oh my God, you mentioned NHS data. Do you know how many projects there have been across the UK?
I know.
Trying to make NHS data accessible and interoperable?
But can I just say something? What is not a solution, sadly, is some of the ideas that I've seen recently around the NHS data trust and private-public partnerships around it. So that's, in my opinion, not necessarily the problem. But solve that issue around data silos, right, and data quality and data access, and you have solutions to open and share that data safely with trusted partners, and then you're going to see the benefits.
Thank you. Lee, you get the last word.
So Sonia stole my data accessibility one. So
You can say the same thing, and then
No,
we
actually,
have...
so at the tech show, I did the keynote in the data theater this year, and I made a call to government, which nobody listened to, and so I'll make it again.
Okay, make it loud and clear.
I think we need to invest in upskilling and cross-skilling the entire population in some of these technologies. I don't mean create 65 million coders, but just know how to use them and know how to curate your own data. We have an apprenticeship program in this country that every big corporate pays into. We could fund it through that. We could use the Open University, and we could very rapidly bring up the just general skill level in this country within a year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.